The words landed like hammers on polished wood. All she's ever done is disappoint me. My father didn't shout them. He didn't need to. Years of command had trained his voice to carry without force, to slice through a room like a parade ground order. Colonel Thomas Donovan, retired, decorated, revered in this town, stood tall in the community hall, chest squared, the kind of presence that made even veterans sit straighter. And in that moment, he turned all that weight not into pride, not into guidance, but into humiliation, directed at me. The gathering should have been simple, a reunion of neighbors, old friends, the sort of small-town event where people drink weak coffee from styrofoam cups and swap stories of who's retired, who's sick, whose grandson made varsity. Folding chairs creaked under men in pressed khakis. Women fanned themselves against the late summer heat. Kids darted between legs with paper cups of lemonade. The air smelled faintly of fried chicken and furniture polish, with a metallic hint clinging to the display case of medals at the back. I walked in with my head high, not expecting a parade, just civility. It had been years since I last stood in the same room as my father. Years since he acknowledged me with anything more than clipped, functional words. And now, here we were, breathing the same air again. He saw me immediately. His eyes narrowed, lips tightening to a hard line. To a stranger, it might have looked like he was about to deliver a solemn speech. Instead, he waited until the chatter dimmed, then detonated his judgment for everyone to hear. All she's ever done is disappoint me. The silence that followed roared louder than applause. It burned my cheeks, rang in my ears. I held my face still, trying to seem composed while every muscle inside screamed to fight back, to shout, to do anything but stand there like a reprimanded child. Then, as if the blow weren't sharp enough, he turned. His hand, broad, calloused, still commanding, landed firmly on the shoulder of a younger man. Broad-shouldered, crisp haircut, instantly recognizable. "This," my father declared with pride swelling in his voice, "this is what a real soldier looks like." The man was Ethan Reyes, a Navy SEAL. The room stirred, impressed murmurs spreading. Heads nodded. Respect rolled toward him like a tide, respect that had never once been offered to me. But then Ethan's eyes met mine. For a moment, his confident expression held. Then it faltered. His lips parted, and in a voice unsteady but clear enough to carry, he whispered words that cut the hall in half. "Are you the Black Widow?" The name froze the air. Conversation stuttered. A veteran straightened in his chair. A teenager swallowed hard. Even my father's smirk slipped, confusion flickering across his face. He didn't know. He had never known. That night in the hall wasn't where the story began. It began years earlier, in a house where silence weighed more than praise, under the shadow of a man who believed legacy could only pass to a son. But in that moment, I realized something had shifted. The room was no longer leaning toward him. Not entirely. The silence in that hall pressed down on me like a weighted blanket. I didn't answer Ethan. I didn't need to. The name he spoke, Black Widow, hung there, undeniable, heavy as iron. And for the first time in years, I saw my father stumble. Not in his step, but in his certainty. His jaw tightened, his brow furrowed, as if he was hearing a language he didn't understand. But before you can understand why a young Navy SEAL would pale at the sight of me, Why he would whisper that name with something between awe and fear, you need to know where it began. It started in a house where discipline was louder than laughter, where silence was sharper than any reprimand. My earliest lessons weren't about kindness or curiosity. They were about posture. I was 8 years old when my father, already retired from the army but never from command, placed my heels together on the kitchen linoleum, shoved my shoulders back, and told me to stand straight. "A straight spine tells the world you won't break," he said. His voice carried the same weight it had on the parade grounds. The kitchen smelled of black coffee and shoe polish, our family's peculiar perfume. My father's medals sat in a glass cabinet like relics, polished weekly, their ribbons perfectly aligned. Every Saturday, it was my job to dust them. Accuracy, he told me, was respect. I learned to hold an iron until its weight felt like duty, to crease fabric so sharp it could cut. Other children memorized song lyrics. I memorized the order of ribbons and the difference between salutes. He believed legacy passed through sons, but he didn't have a son. He had me, and in his eyes that was failure number 1. Every choice I made after that only seemed to prove his point. My mother, Evelyn, lived differently. She fought his storms not with resistance, but with patience. She slipped folded poems into my lunchbox, Frost, Hughes, Dickinson. Little spells of resilience. At night, when my father's silence filled the house, she whispered, "Stand tall, Claire. The wind can bend you, but it can't break you unless you let it." Michael, my younger brother, was still too young to see the cracks. My father pinned his hopes on him, spoke of the Donovan legacy as if it were a uniform waiting in a closet. Michael tried to carry that weight for a while, but even then, I could see his heart wasn't in it. He wasn't meant for the battlefield. And though he never said it aloud, I think he admired me for trying to shoulder what our father demanded. Admired me, but never dared to intervene. I learned early how to live under that roof. Keep your bed tight as a drum, your shoes polished, your face blank. Achievements never mattered. Straight A's earned a grunt. Winning a track meet brought only a comment about sloppy form. And yet, even under that weight, a stubborn fire grew in me. Not to please him, not even to defy him, but to prove to myself that I could carve a place where his rules didn't reach. That fire would carry me farther than he ever imagined. By the time I turned 15, the house felt less like a home and more like a barracks. Breakfast was silent, except for the scrape of cutlery and the hum of the morning news. Beds had to be made with corners sharp enough to impress a drill sergeant. Shoes lined up at a perfect 45. Any slip, one speck of dust, a crease out of line, was met not with anger, but with something worse. My father's cold, disappointed silence. Michael tried to stay invisible. He buried himself in books about engines and circuits, things my father dismissed as civilian toys. My father spoke to him with hope, though, a hope Michael could never quite carry. That hope turned to pressure, and pressure turned to quiet rebellion. Michael never shouted, never fought back, but I saw it in the way he kept his eyes down, the way he'd sneak in a comic book between history assignments. For me, the weight was heavier. My father never said it outright, but I knew. I was the wrong child. He wanted a son to inherit the legacy, and instead, he got me, a daughter, a disappointment. But my mother, Evelyn, refused to let that belief be the only truth I carried. On nights when I stayed up late with my homework, she would sit beside me, marking essays from her own students, her voice soft. "What do you want most, Claire?" she asked once. I stared at the page, then whispered, "A fair fight." She tapped the pencil against the desk, thoughtful. "Then you'll need to learn how to weather storms. Unfair storms. That's where strength lives." The thought grew in me, quiet but insistent. By my senior year of high school, it had taken root. I wanted to join the Naval Academy, not to earn his approval, not to fit into his shadow, but because I wanted to measure myself on a field where excuses didn't matter, where merit spoke louder than bloodlines. The night I told him, the house seemed to hold its breath. He was sitting at the kitchen table, ledger open, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. I stood there, palms sweating, and said, "Dad, I'm applying to Annapolis." He didn't look up. He just turned a page. "You want attention," he said flatly. "No," I answered. "I want to serve." That made him glance at me. His eyes were hard, unreadable. He folded the ledger closed. "You don't have what it takes." He wasn't talking about grades or stamina. He meant gender. The silence that followed was worse than any argument. He rose, put the ledger back on the shelf, and left the room without another word. I should have felt crushed. Instead, the fire in me only burned hotter. So I sent in my application. In secret. On a quiet night after he'd gone to bed, I typed the essay at the kitchen table, the same table where he had dismissed me. I wrote about discipline, about resilience, about how silence can forge steel if you know how to stand in it. When the letter came months later, "We are pleased to inform you," I pressed it against my chest until the paper chilled my skin. That morning, I walked into his study and handed him the envelope. He read the first line, stopped, then folded it back up. "We'll discuss it later," he said. We never did, but I packed my bags anyway. On the morning of my departure, my mother slipped 3 envelopes into my backpack. Open when you feel alone. Open when you're hurt. Open when you forget who you are. She hugged me so tightly I could still feel her arms long after the bus pulled away. My father? He wasn't there. He had an appointment at the auto shop. As the bus rolled past the edges of our small town, the diner with its lemon pies, the flag outside the courthouse too big for its pole, I pressed my forehead to the window and made a vow. I wasn't running away from him. I was running toward the only fight that mattered, the one that would prove to myself and to the world that I belonged. Annapolis didn't welcome me with open arms. It stripped me down to nothing and dared me to rebuild. The air smelled of salt and chlorine. The days started before sunrise, and the rhythm of boots against pavement echoed like a heartbeat I had to match or be left behind. My classmates shouted cadences until their voices cracked. I learned quickly that the trick wasn't to be the loudest, it was to be precise. To place every step, every word, every breath exactly where it belonged. At night, lying in a narrow bunk, I repeated the general orders under my breath until the numbers became prayers. My muscles ached. My skin burned from the sun. But deep inside, I carried the same vow I had whispered on the bus. I belong here. Letters from my mother arrived on cream-colored paper, her handwriting looping and careful. She never asked about grades or scores. She asked, "Do you still stand tall? Did you remember to breathe?" I never told her how badly I shook during inspections, how many times I failed to meet the perfect angle of a fold, how much I wanted to scream back when an upperclassman barked in my face. Instead, I wrote, "Yes, Mom, I'm standing." My father never wrote, not once. Michael sent a postcard from his engineering classes, a sketch of a gear with a smiley face in the middle. "Keep grinding, sis," he scrawled on the back. I pinned it above my desk, a quiet rebellion in a room where nothing personal was supposed to show. By the end of that first summer, I had survived what broke others. The academy didn't love me, but it taught me to measure myself without anyone else's approval. I learned that exhaustion can be folded away in a corner, that fear can be compartmentalized, that silence can be sharpened into resolve. And when they pinned those bars on my shoulders, commissioning me as an officer, I looked in the mirror and saw someone my father would never recognize. But I didn't need him to, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about the life I was carving, piece by piece, into a place that had tried to erase me. Coronado greeted me with sand in my teeth and salt in my hair. The Pacific wind blew hard enough to make even seasoned men stumble, and the training grounds were littered with logs, ropes, and the kind of grit that lived beneath fingernails for weeks. I wasn't there to become a sail. That door was bolted shut to women at the time, and honestly, I didn't waste breath arguing with locked doors. My role was different, but no less critical: intelligence and operations. My job was to draw the map before the breach, to anticipate the cracks, to weave the net tight enough that the men who stormed through came back alive. They called me ma'am at first, the word sharp-edged, half question, half resentment. I answered not with speeches, but with clean schedules, tight comms, flawless logistics. When the truck stalled, I had contingencies. When batteries lied about their charge, I already had spares. Slowly, the doubt in their eyes began to thin. Captain Hill was the first to really see it. One evening, I spread maps across the hood of a dusty Humvee, marking arcs and routes with grease pencil. Hill leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the layers of lines I had drawn. "You like spider webs, Lieutenant?" he asked, half amused. I didn't look up. Spider webs catch what doesn't know it's trapped. He chuckled, but his eyes told me he understood. Torres wasn't as quick. He called me the clerk for weeks, rolling his eyes when I insisted on rehearsing alternate exits or running the timing 3 more times. But after one mission where a bad axle nearly derailed the convoy and my backup plan rerouted them in seconds, he stopped smirking. He still grumbled, but he followed my lead. That's when the nickname began to stick. Not Claire Donovan, not even Lieutenant. Black Widow. Not because I killed, but because I spun webs that held. The first time I heard it whispered behind me, I pretended not to notice. The second time, I let it sit in the air. By the third time, even the hard-eyed seals tapped the table twice before walking out the door, as if the superstition of my web might keep them breathing. It wasn't glory. It wasn't fame. It was survival. And survival, in those days, was the only victory that mattered. The first real mission came faster than any of us expected. A bomb maker had turned a forgotten quarter of the city into his workshop, and intelligence suggested he was days away from finishing something that could erase a market full of children. We studied his patterns for weeks: where he bought bread, which alley he used when he thought no one was watching, what time the man who sold cigarettes lit his first smoke. I strung it all together like beads on a thread, each detail tightening the noose. The night we moved, the air smelled of diesel and dust. Radios hissed with code words that felt more like prayers. I sat hunched over a folding table in a dim, borrowed room, eyes flicking between the grainy feeds of our drones and the neat lines of the plan I'd written. Ethan Reyes was new then, fresh-faced, jaw still soft, eyes wide with that mix of adrenaline and fear young men never admit to. He carried himself tall, but his hands gave him away. They tapped his rifle stock like he was trying to steady a rhythm. The convoy rolled, headlights blacked out. At the second intersection, one of the trucks sputtered and died, 2 blocks earlier than we'd rehearsed. Voices rose, clipped, tense. Torres cursed under his breath. "Switch to Route C," I ordered into the mic, voice level. "Church Street. Advance the timeline 5 minutes." A pause. Then Hill's gravelly confirmation. "Copy." Route C. The bomb maker stepped into the night right on schedule, cigarette already between his lips. He turned left, exactly as predicted. His phone reached for a signal that wasn't there, because I had already ordered that tower silenced. He froze, confused, half a beat too long. That's all it took. Shadows closed in. Plastic cuffs snapped. No shots fired, no flames, just silence. When the team returned, adrenaline still sparking in the air, Ethan lingered near my table. His helmet was tucked under his arm, sweat dripping down his temples. You saw that coming," he said quietly. Not a question, more like a realization. "I saw what could happen," I corrected. "That's the only kind of sight that matters." He nodded slowly, the weight of it sinking in. That was the night he started watching me differently, not as a clerk, not as an outsider, but as the web that had kept him alive. By dawn, someone had scrawled a spider in black Sharpie on the corner of my map, a messy little sketch with a red hourglass. Torres laughed at it, but he didn't erase it. And from then on, whenever Ethan looked at me, his eyes carried the memory of that night, the night Black Widow became more than just a rumor. Reputation never arrives like thunder. It seeps in, quiet at first, passed over lukewarm coffee in briefing tents, traded between teams on flights that stretched across continents. By the time we rotated through Bahrain, my name preceded me, though never in full. Just whispers. The woman who hears the web. Captain Hill was the first to put it into words. He was old school, the kind of man who carried scars like rank and didn't waste breath on compliments. One night, as we spread maps across a crate in the desert wind, he tapped the arcs I'd drawn. "You hear it before the rest of us," he said, "like a spider when the thread shakes." Torres snorted. "Or maybe she just gets lucky." But even he didn't erase the spider doodles that had started to appear on our charts, sketched by bored hands in mess halls and briefing rooms. Ethan Reyes, though, never treated it like a joke. He followed my instructions with a focus that bordered on reverence. Once, after a chaotic night raid where a single misstep could have collapsed the whole plan, he lingered again by my side. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but steady. "I don't know how to explain it, but when you talk, it feels like the noise cuts away, like you've already walked the ground we're about to cross." I wanted to tell him it wasn't magic, that it was just patience, observation, and the discipline drilled into me by years under my father's iron shadow. But I didn't, because in a way, Ethan wasn't wrong. Every plan I built carried echoes of those nights at home. Dishes lined in precision, shoes at 45 degrees, silence heavier than sound. The Navy didn't hand out medals for keeping men alive through foresight. There was no ribbon for weaving threads invisible to anyone else. But in the eyes of men like Hill and even Torres, I could see something shifting. Respect. The one thing Colonel Thomas Donovan had always said I would never earn. And so the name spread. Black Widow. Not a creature to be feared, but a web you trusted to hold when the floor gave way. By then, I knew the truth. I didn't need my father's acknowledgement. I had built something stronger. A family chosen not by blood, but by the way they gnashed their teeth against chaos, and still trusted me to draw the lines that brought them home. While my name grew heavier overseas, home grew quieter. Evelyn Donovan, my mother, was fading. It began with little things. A hesitation on the phone, a cough that lingered, her handwriting smaller in the cards she mailed me. When I finally came home between deployments, the truth was unavoidable. Her frame had shrunk, her skin translucent like paper left in the sun. Yet she still tucked poems into my duffel before I left, her way of saying she believed in more than uniforms and medals. "Stand tall, Claire," she whispered once, her breath thin against my ear. "Not just for him. For yourself." She never had to say who he was. My father's shadow filled the house even when he wasn't in the room. Colonel Thomas Donovan remained the immovable force he'd always been. Iron back, unyielding rules. He drove Michael hard, hoping his son would pick up the mantle of military honor that I had supposedly squandered. But Michael, with his quiet brilliance for numbers and machines, wasn't built for salutes and rifles. He wanted bridges, circuits, classrooms, things that bent toward creation, not destruction. That left me, always me, as the disappointment. The daughter who chose service, but in the wrong uniform, the wrong way, the wrong gender. During one visit, I caught him polishing his medals at the dining table, each ribbon aligned like soldiers on parade. Without looking up, he asked, "Still pushing papers for the SEALs?" I could have told him about the men I guided home, about the nights when silence over the radio meant life instead of death. But I didn't. I simply said, "Yes, sir." Because I knew no matter what truth I offered, he would never hear it. When the call finally came that my mother's treatments were failing, I was half a world away. Captain Hill saw it in my face before I spoke a word. He gave a rare nod, one soldier to another, and said, "Go." Some battles don't wait. I made it back in time for her last spring. The house smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender. Michael sat by her side with textbooks unopened in his lap, as if his presence alone might hold her here. She reached for my hand, her palm frail but still warm. "Claire," she whispered, "don't let silence be your inheritance. You've built your own wings. Promise me you'll use them. Not to fly away, but to fly upward." That was Evelyn Donovan's last gift. Permission to rise, even if my father never looked up to see it. When she was gone, the house grew heavier, not lighter. My father stood at the funeral like a statue carved from stone, nodding at folded flags and whispered condolences, but offering nothing to me or Michael. His silence was a verdict, and he thought it final. But he was wrong, because the echoes of my mother's voice carried further than his silence ever could. After my mother's funeral, I did what soldiers do best. I buried grief under orders. I returned to the field sooner than anyone expected. The desert, the salt air, the tension of missions. They became easier to face than an empty house in Virginia and a father who refused to meet my eyes. At Coronado, Captain Hill was waiting. He didn't ask about the funeral. He simply handed me a clipboard with new assignments and said, "Widow, you ready?" Widow. The nickname had followed me everywhere by then. At first whispered in jest, then repeated with respect. Black Widow wasn't about death. It was about the webs I spun, the way I caught chaos before it tore men apart. Torres, who once mocked my checklists, now ran through them line by line without complaint. He had seen too many near misses saved by one line scribbled in my notebook. And then there was Ethan Reyes. Younger, eager, still rough around the edges. On a mission in Alcar, he nearly made a fatal mistake. Took a wrong turn that would have put the team into an ambush. My voice crackled through his headset. "Stop, but just 2 degrees west." He hesitated for just a heartbeat, then obeyed. When the dust cleared, when every man walked back alive, Ethan found me after. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "You saved us," he said. I shook my head. No, the plan did. But I saw the way he looked at me after that. Not like a paper pusher, not like a woman out of place among warriors. He looked at me like someone he could trust with his life. Mission after mission, the pattern held. I built the webs, the teams moved through them, and lives were spared. The Sales weren't sentimental men, but they knew survival when they saw it. Before long, even the hardest skeptics tapped twice on the table before stepping out. A silent superstition borrowed from me. The legend of Black Widow spread, not in headlines or parades, but in whispers across airfields and briefing rooms. And still, back home, my father sat in his chair, the town calling him Colonel with reverence, never knowing his daughter's name was spoken with equal weight in places he would never see. Michael sent me emails now and then, updates about his job, photos of bridges he helped design. Once he wrote, "I wish Dad could understand, but I do. I'm proud of you, Claire." I read that message in a tent lit by red lamps, the smell of gun oil in the air, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe. Because sometimes, one voice of recognition can outweigh a lifetime of silence. The community hall smelled of coffee left too long on the burner, and polished wood rubbed smooth by years of bingo nights. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of veterans in pressed khakis, their medals catching the dim light. Women waved paper fans. Children darted between tables, laughter skipping like stones. On the surface, it was just another small-town gathering. Until my father stood. Colonel Thomas Donovan, retired, but never relinquished his rank. His back straight as a rifle barrel, his voice carrying without effort. Applause rippled, automatic, respectful. My father smiled, satisfied. It was a script he'd rehearsed his entire life. The strong praised, the weak diminished. But Ethan didn't move like a man receiving praise. He froze. His jaw tightened. He looked at me, really looked, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Memory. A battlefield replayed in silence between us. Then his voice broke the room. "Sir, is she not the Black Widow?" The words cut through the air like a blade. Conversations stopped mid-breath. A veteran in the back straightened. A young man near the coffee table choked on his drink. The name hung there, impossible to ignore. Black Widow. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The nickname had lived in shadows, carried in whispers across bases and barracks. And now, in a hall filled with the people who had always believed my father's version of me. It stood naked under the lights. My father blinked. For the first time in years, the surety on his face cracked. He didn't know what Ethan knew. He didn't know the stories carried in radio static and desert nights. Black Widow, someone repeated, barely more than a whisper. But whispers spread like wildfire. Ethan's voice steadied. I served with her. We came home because of her. She doesn't just file papers. She saves lives. The hall tilted. The respect that had clung to my father began to shift, not all at once, but like a tide turning beneath the surface. And for the first time, I wasn't just his daughter. I was something else. The silence after Ethan's words was heavier than any applause. It pressed against the walls, against every chest in the room. You could hear the ceiling fan turning, the faint rattle of its chain, the hum of the old vending machine in the corner. My father's hand dropped from Ethan's shoulder, as though it had burned him. His jaw worked, but no sound came. He looked from Ethan to me, and then to the crowd, searching for support the way a drowning man searches for shore. But the room had already begun to move. A veteran near the back, Vietnam judging by the patch on his jacket, leaned forward, his elbows digging into his knees, his eyes fixed on me with a weight I'd only ever seen pointed at my father. A woman with her hair tied in a bun, a schoolteacher I half remembered from childhood, lowered her fan and simply nodded once, as if confirming something she'd suspected but never said aloud. Black Widow, someone else murmured. And this time, the name didn't sound like rumor. It sounded like respect. My father tried to laugh it off, a brittle sound that broke before it left his throat. Nicknames. You know how soldiers are. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here. The words landed with the weight of testimony, not flattery. The veterans shifted in their seats. Even the children stilled, sensing something larger than themselves unraveling in front of them. My father's face tightened. His pride had been his armor all his life, and now it was denting, piece by piece. He began, but stopped. The words wouldn't come. I took a half step forward, not to gloat, not to strike back, just enough so that my voice could reach the corners of the room. It's only a name, I said quietly. Names are lighter than the work. What matters is whether For years it had silenced rooms, but tonight it only made the silence heavier. His eyes found me, not with pride, not with fury, something worse. Confusion. As if the world had redrawn itself without asking his permission. What is this? He said at last, his voice low, not booming. Stories? Exaggerations? You're my daughter. The word daughter left his lips like a verdict, as if it explained away everything Ethan had said, as if family ties erased the evidence of who I'd become. Ethan didn't flinch. Neither did the veterans who now leaned forward, listening harder. The hall was no longer his alone. I held his gaze. Yes, because you never wanted to hear it. Every time I stood up, you told me I was a disappointment, so I stopped telling you. I let the work speak where you never would. For a moment, he looked younger, less the colonel, more the man who had once carried too much weight in his own father's shadow. His shoulders dropped, just slightly. From the back, a veteran's voice rang out, rough and certain. Colonel, with all respect, you should be proud. We all are. The word, it doesn't pass from father to son or from rank to name. It has to be earned, day by day, action by action. Sometimes in rooms no one sees, sometimes right here. The words settled. A hush followed, not empty, but full of reckoning. Ethan stood straighter, as if answering a roll call. Then a veteran near the coffee urn placed his hand over his chest. Another rose quietly from his chair, and then another. The sound of folding chairs scraping the floor became a chorus. Men and women of the town, some who had once only nodded to my father, some who had never looked at me twice, stood together, their faces steady, their eyes on me. My father remained seated, arms still folded, but the lines around his eyes betrayed something raw. Fear, maybe shame. For the first time, the weight of the room did not belong to him. I didn't need him to stand, not yet. The shift had already happened. The hall had chosen, and in that choice, I felt something I'd been chasing all my life. Not applause, not vindication, recognition. When the meeting broke, people drifted toward the coffee table, their voices hushed but urgent. Some shook my hand, others just nodded, the kind of nod that meant more than words. Ethan slipped out quietly, giving me space. My father lingered near the stage, pretending to study the flag as if it might give him back his footing. His arms were still crossed, but the iron in his posture had softened. I walked to him, not quickly, not triumphantly, just steady. He turned as I stopped a few feet away. For the first time that night, he didn't look past me. He looked at me. If any of that was true. His voice cracked on the if. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't, I said softly. And you never asked. The words landed between us like stones, undeniable, immovable. His shoulders sagged, just barely, as if the weight he carried had shifted an inch. I wanted a son, he admitted, voice low, brittle. I thought legacy meant a name carried forward. Maybe I was wrong. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the closest he had ever come. I let the silence sit, then answered, Legacy isn't a name, Dad. It's the way people stand when you're gone. His eyes flickered, pain, recognition, maybe both. For once, he didn't argue. He just nodded, small, almost invisible. But it was enough. We didn't embrace, we didn't shake hands. We simply stood together under the tired lights of the community hall, in a space that felt less like a battlefield and more like the first bridge. That night, when the hall finally emptied, I walked outside into the cool dark. The town lay quiet, street lamps humming, the flag out front barely moving in the breeze. I stood on the steps a long while, letting the silence settle. People think strength is noise. Orders barked, fists slammed, voices raised to fill a room. But I had learned otherwise. Strength lives in steadiness, in the choice to stand when others sit, in the discipline of silence held until it matters. My mother's words returned, her voice faint but steady as the night wind. Fly up, not away. I realized I had, not by escaping, but by standing taller, by holding ground she had prepared for me with her quiet resilience. Inside, my father was still sitting alone. He hadn't stood tonight, but the crack in his armor was real. One day, maybe, he would rise, and if he did, it wouldn't erase the years of silence. It would honor the moment he finally broke it. Respect is not inherited. It cannot be demanded. It is earned in the way we live, in the choices we make when no one is watching, and in the courage to keep standing when the weight of the room shifts against us. If you've carried storms of your own, if you've been told you were not enough, remember this: endurance is not weakness. It is the soil where strength takes root. And when the time comes, when your silence breaks, you will find you were stronger than they ever believed. The night ended without applause, without ceremony, just the sound of the flag rustling, the wooden steps creaking under my boots, and a town that had begun, finally, to stand a little taller. If you've ever been told you were not enough, if someone tried to silence you or make you smaller, remember this: respect is not a gift passed down, it's earned. And endurance is not weakness, it is the soil where strength grows. True power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the steady voice that speaks when the room has gone quiet. Sometimes it's the choice to stand tall when everyone expects you to bow. So if you're carrying storms of your own, hold on. Keep standing. Because when the moment comes, when silence finally breaks, the world will see what you've built all along. And that is the kind of strength no one can take away from you.